Welcome to another episode of Decode. He doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. He sleeps 6 hours. He trains every day. He got divorced so he could focus better on his job. He's not a movie supervillain. He's just a man disciplined to the edge of paranoia. Now I want you to imagine you are Vladimir Putin. You have an army, you have the Secret Service, you have nuclear weapons, and still you have one single fear in your heart, the fear of losing control. This video is not about politics. It's a deep dive inside the mind of one of the most powerful but also most isolated leaders of the 21st century. We're not here to blame. We're here to answer just one question. How does a man think when he cannot even admit that he may be wrong? So today, in a special two-part episode of Decode, inside the mind of Vladimir Putin. Imagine you're a child. No PlayStation. No room, not even a corner that you can call your own. Just a basement with rats and fear. Outside, the hunger, the post-war streets of Leningrad. Inside, silence. The type of silence where people don't talk, they just barely survive. This is where Vladimir Putin was born. It's 1952. His mother survived the siege and nearly died. His father is a war invalid. They lived in a communal apartment, one of these houses where several families clustered together, often with no heating and water on schedule. And this is the reality of post-war Russia, not some sort of Netflix script. And Putin was the youngest child soaking all this environment in. He didn't dream of becoming a president. The only thing he dreamt of was not to be perceived as weak. If you were humiliated as a child, you learned to seek control, because in control lies protection. If your safety was stolen, you want everybody around you to live by your own rules, even if that means turning the whole country into a basement with guards. Putin, in an interview, will later say, "The street raised me, and if I didn't fight back, I was a nobody." It's not just a quote, it's a survival ideology, and it never left him. He grew up where weakness was an invitation to violence, where trust was a luxury, and where attack was the best form of defense. And here comes the first psychological trait of Vladimir Putin. He doesn't want to be loved, he doesn't want to be respected, he wants to be feared, because in his mind, fear is the only thing that will never let you down. It's worth noting how many world leaders actually follow a similar life story as Putin, starting for example with Mao Zedong, the initial leader of communist China, who grew up in an environment of constant military conflict. If we move on to current China, Xi Jinping actually saw his family purge when he was just a small child. Moving on to, for example, Lukashenko from Belarus, similar story. He was raised fatherless and in poverty. And even if we move to Donald Trump, which is extremely different from all this, we see similar traits. This survival, ultra-competitive mentality, or being raised thinking win or be nothing. None of them is actually evil, it's just childhood trauma that grew into an adult strategy. The strategy that the world is a dangerous place, so I can only trust myself, and everybody else is either a resource or a threat. So Putin isn't building an empire for greatness, he's actually building a shelter from his childhood past, where nothing slips out of control, where every street is actually watched by cameras, where even the rats are in payroll of the state. This isn't megalomania, it's survival instinct scaled to the size of a nation. Even today, he still eats cottage cheese and honey and drinks kefir. So the young Putin became a man. At this stage in his life, he didn't dream of becoming a president, not even some sort of middle ground bureaucrat. He was just a young KGB agent. His job was not to defend the truth. His job was to discover what others are hiding and hide what you've learned along the way. Welcome to Vladimir Putin's world, where the truth does not exist, only data and threats. Of course, since some years have passed, I'm going to explain a little bit what the KGB was all about. It was not the police, it was not even the military, it was the eyes and the ears of the state, but also its brain and its claws. So the core functions of the KGB were three. First, collection of data on everyone and everything, a police state. Second, manipulation and disinformation to influence without engaging in open conflict. And third, counterintelligence, which means basically legalized distrust. This is not a James Bond movie or one of those novels by John le Carré. This is the daily reality where you don't even trust your own past. Now you need to think about Vladimir Putin. He spent 16 years in the KGB, several of them in Dresden, East Germany, where every step was watched and every contact could be a trap. There, he said he learned, if panic starts, you must be the first one to act. Remember this sentence when we speak later on in this video about the war in Ukraine. How does the KGB shape your mind? The KGB doesn't teach you to think like a philosopher. It teaches you more how to stalk, how to hide, how to wait, and when to strike. This is a predator thinking, not so much a reformer thinking. If you live by KGB logic, you don't build, you calculate. You don't trust, you identify weaknesses. And you don't dialogue, you control the narrative. That's why Putin does not believe in randomness, only in conspiracies. That's why he hates the press, because it's uncontrollable. And that's why he rejects spontaneity, because it's dangerous to him. 16 years in the KGB is not a job. It's more like a university in distrust with a PhD in total control. That's why Vladimir Putin does not like democracy, because to him, democracy is just background noise that disrupts him from the master plan. He's not a movie villain. He's a man who's learned too early that vulnerability equals danger, and now teaches the whole country to live by the same rule. And he didn't pull the trigger, he didn't kill, or at least there is no reliable sources that confirm that. But he didn't sympathize either. The years in the KGB taught him something else, that information is the most useful weapon. We're now going to move on to the beginnings of Vladimir Putin's political career, and one of the key traits of his ideology, which is the idea of the vertical. So let's explain that. Let's say you grew up in a wreckage of a country, betrayal, rats, first literal but also political. Let's say you watch your country collapse. No war, no gunfire, it just folded like a house of cards. What would you choose? Would you choose chaos or would you choose control? Across all his speeches, starting in the year 2000 and all the way to 2024, one idea has always stood out in Vladimir Putin's thinking, which is the idea of the vertical. He said, we need a strong power vertical, only then is stability possible. He said this at economic forums, annual addresses, and even in interviews. For him, a vertical is not just a hierarchy, it's a defense mechanism against collapse, because the only thing worse than a dictatorship in Putin's mind is anarchy. So let's explain what is a vertical. Putin does not believe in traditional institutions and division of power and all that kind of stuff. He believes in personal loyalty. The courts shouldn't be fair, they should be controlled. The media shouldn't be free, they should be predictable. And businesses shouldn't be independent, they should know their place in the whole ecosystem. But this is not because Putin is greedy or evil, it's just a way of cognitive defense. His childhood equation, remember, is freedom equals chaos and control equals survival. Why does he believe in this? He believes in this because of the events that happened in Russia with the collapse of the USSR. Let's go one by one. In 1991, the USSR collapses. Specifically, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved. Mikhail Gorbachev resigns, and no military, no institution, no elite group tries to resist. Power is passed to Boris Yeltsin and the newly formed Russian Federation. It was peaceful but chaotic. From one day to the next, 15 new countries emerged, and the USSR as we knew it simply vanished. Let's move on to 1993. There's a constitutional crisis between President Boris Yeltsin and the Russian parliament. Parliament tried to impeach Yeltsin, and Yeltsin declared the parliament dissolved illegally. On October 4, 1993, actually Yeltsin orders tanks from the army to actually open fire against the Russian White House, the parliament building, the Duma. At least 150 people died, and it was the deadliest political violence in Moscow since 1917, so since the Russian Revolution. The result is that Yeltsin pushed through a new super presidential constitution for Russia, and many argue that any hope and any hint of a future democracy in the Western sense of the word for Russia died on that day. After the collapse of the USSR, Russia plunged into a huge economic crisis. Price liberalization triggered hyperinflation. State factories collapsed with millions of people actually losing their jobs. Oligarchs, they bought national assets cheaply via rigged privatizations. Mafia-style violence erupted, incomes fell, poverty and hunger rose dramatically. Putin's ideology was defined on those terrible years. The idea is very, very simple. If I let go of the control, everything will collapse again. But there's a twist. Many academics have studied authoritarian regimes, and they think they're about control and the fight between democracy and chaos. But if you ask Putin, actually he has a different opinion. He says democracy is a mask. Everybody wears that mask because it's convenient, but in reality power is always held by those who control the access to the resources. It's a cynical view, but it's very logical from the mindset of someone who grew up in a basement. And he's not alone. If you look at other leaders, they have kind of like similar opinions. Xi Jinping, who we mentioned before, has spoken of discipline through stability. Viktor Orban in Hungary promotes a national vertical. Lukashenko in Belarus invokes order over chaos. Even Trump plays with this idea of losing control and uses it to break division of power. And this is not a coincidence, it's a global trend. We live in scary times. When the world changes too quickly, basically the world feels scared and people reach out for order, even if that costs them part of their freedom. So Putin is not building an empire for glory, he's building a bunker of power to keep out the same forces that once broke his country and that he fears the most, which are chaos, spontaneity, and equality. He does not believe in equals, he believes in a ladder, one that you climb only if someone lets you. In his world, fear is the cement of power, and strength is not a form of aggression, but it's the absence of weakness. Putin does not like surprises. Even today, he goes on vacation to the same place, a lakeside dacha where he can be alone. Over the years, his inner circle has shrunk to basically a few advisors, guards, doctors, so the higher his power, the fewer people around. Let's now move on to the way Putin makes decisions. If you want to understand his brain, you need to stop using the cliché of the mad dictator. He doesn't shout, he doesn't explode, he doesn't act out of rage. Putin is not impulsive, he's an operative. His style is quiet, cold, and calculated. Putin behaves like a surgeon that picks up the scalpel, not because he wants to, but because it needs to be done. Let's see this in action in his first mandates. In the early 2000s, Putin comes to power, not as a populist, but more like a manager with a stabilization mandate. His first moves are very predictable if you have been following the video so far. First, he centralizes control over the regions. He creates presidential envoys to every federal district of Russia for control. Second, he takes over national television. ORT and NTV become state control. Again, control. Third, he neutralizes oligarchs. People like Gusinski, Berezovsky, and Khodorkovsky get their wings cut from one day to the next. And last, he rebuilds the power system to his liking. Judiciary, legislative, and electoral branches, now they all obey his power. In 2008, Putin makes a very surprising move. Formally, he steps down as president, pushing to the forefront his henchman Medvedev, and he just becomes prime minister. But he actually never gives control. This was really a stress test. Putin wanted to set up his structure, and once the structure was in place, he wanted to move to the side just to make sure the system became loyal even when he was not at the top of the pyramid. We can now move on to analyzing the way Putin handles people. He doesn't have a team in the Western sense of the word composed with, advisors and ministers and that kind of stuff. There is no brainstorming sessions, there is no dissenting opinions. He uses people as tools. He's going to have one person of his full loyalty and trust for foreign policy, another one for TV, another one covering financial interests of Russia. Each of these persons is like a cog in a big system, and each one of them knows their place. So if someone steps out of the line, they will vanish, and we've seen this over and over through the years, politically or even literally. Putin will not say, "Oh, you're a traitor." He will simply stop finding you useful, and that's a dangerous place to be. Why does he operate this way? This is not paranoia, this is a very structural mindset. Psychologists call this cognitive restraint. It is the ability to suppress emotions and empathy in service of long-term goals. Putin can wait, he can endure isolation, he won't make a move unless the outcome has been very carefully calculated. And so his method is basically to apply pressure because he knows he's stronger and the other side would crack first. Let's look at the contrast with other types of leaders. For example, Trump is very impulsive and it's very driven by the media moment, always trying to be in the spotlight, always trying to control the message on the media. Erdogan, for example, in Turkey, is reactive and responds easily to threats. Lukashenko, Belarus, is chaotic and driven by fear. Putin is more like an algorithm, slow, cold and very methodical. He's not chasing approval. He's not aiming for popularity because he doesn't need it. He plays the long game, and this is a game that he knows he masters really well and that he can play it alone. As I said, Putin is not a politician in the Western sense of the word that needs approvals and campaigns. He doesn't run campaigns. He builds systems. In his mind, there is no people. There's just territory, threat, structure, and order. Every decision is like a surgical incision, not to heal, but to prevent the growth of an infection. The problem with this surgical approach is that sometimes he cuts too much or too early, and even when the patient never asks for surgery, he's going to end up sedated. He has no friends, only instruments. Check it out. He divorced in 2014. Even his ex-wife is a ghost of the public life today. His daughters, we know he's got 2 daughters from his first wife. There's shadows in the background. All we know is that one of them lives in Moscow and the other one lives in Germany. But try to find out their last name, the one they use today. You will not find it online. We know Putin loves to practice judo. He's done this his whole life, and he's a 8th Dan black belt. He plays hockey. He loves animals. He funds science and geography initiatives, and he loves to retreat to Alexei dacha in the Leningrad region for peace. His routine is very strict. His discipline total, but still rumors swirl about an out-of-marriage daughter that he conceived in 2003, about a romantic relationship with Alina Kavaeva, an Olympic champion, and possibly the mother of 2 additional children. He's never confirmed any of this, but the scale of the secrecy around these ideas speaks volumes. We have explained the idea of the vertical of power. We have explained the way he makes decisions, the way he uses people. It's now time to move on to kind of like the core tenet of Putin's ideology, which is this idea of the enemy as the glue of power. The idea is very simple. Again, if you want to rule millions, the best way to do this is to actually give them an enemy as a source of unity. Not to give them a goal, not to give them a dream, but to give them a threat. Because if you give people a dream or a goal, they're going to judge you around the performance of setting up that goal and actually fulfilling it, right? You could generate frustration when that goal is not achieved further down the line. But if you have an enemy and you can carry on building new enemies, you can be in power forever, uniting your people around this common fear of this imaginary enemy that you have built. I'm going to show you how Putin has learned to build enemies through the years. Again, every regime needs legitimacy, and if it doesn't have it, fear will do. And fear needs some sort of direction, Either the enemy is outside the country or the enemy is inside the country. Of course, it's a better idea to direct your fear towards an outside enemy, because if you do inside enemies, they can rip your country from within. Let's take a look at that in the history of Russia and Vladimir Putin. He started doing internal enemies. In the year 2000s, those enemies were the oligarchs, Oh, they're looting the country. Oh, we will restore order. Oh, we will stop them from actually stealing the richness of the country. You see, this is an inside enemy. Scary because, of course, you're actually building an opponent who could actually try to overthrow you. Then, as we move on, Putin learns the lesson and begins generating enemies outside of Russia. In 2004 to 2008, basically there were the Orange Revolutions in the vicinity of Russia, but not directly in Russia. And Putin began actually floating this idea of the outside enemy. Check it out. Oh, look at Ukraine. Oh, look at Georgia. Do you want that kind of chaos here in our motherland in Russia? You see, he's moved from an internal enemy to an external one. Let's move on to 2014. Now it's the Maidan and Ukraine specifically. Oh, they are fascist. This is the State Department of the US. They are threatening the rights of the Russian speaker community in Ukraine. You see, again, an outside enemy. And then we arrive to 2020s, and it's the West, us, the LGTBs, the internet, the vaccines, protest, all the modern life that's actually trying to disrupt the traditional Russia. You see, so Putin needs an enemy because an enemy unites the country. It's something that you can sustain for a long time. He began using this trick with inside enemies, but that's risky because they could actually fight against you and overthrow your regime. And then very rapidly he began to learn that it's much safer to actually do it with outside enemies, and that's what he has been doing for the last 20 years, building enemies to stay in power. In the world of Vladimir Putin, this enemy theory is a technique. As was expressed by political philosopher Carl Schmitt, a politic begins when the distinction between friend and enemy emerges. For Vladimir Putin, Putin, this is not abstract. This is a governing structure. Internal enemies are manufactured to justify repression. You know, the LGTBs, the oligarchs. External enemies justify militarization, isolation, and mobilization. And so when the system shows its age and when it begins to crack, a new enemy must be activated for the perpetuation of the system. Examples, you know, if you have protests, the enemy is the youth with the iPhones, and those iPhones are actually giving bad ideas to them. When there's economic crisis, you know, the blame is for the West and the sanctions on Russia. When there's regional discontent, it may be foreign NGOs or the LGBT community. It's just a pressure release, not through reform, but by directing the anger of the population towards one enemy. Psychologists call this the rally around the flag effect. When a society feels external pressure, people stop asking questions because we're scared, we're tribal, and so we rally around the leader. The popularity and the support of this leader temporarily rises, and criticism to the leader is actually confused with betrayal. That's why at the start of military conflicts, research shows that leaders' approval rate actually spike by between 10 and 20%. Putin knows this, and that's why he's not seeking victory. If he achieved victory in Ukraine, that conflict would be over. What he's actually seeking is a permanent conflict that fuels his regime. Because as long as there's an enemy, his system has a purpose. If the enemy disappears, if the war in Ukraine ended, people would begin asking themselves questions. You know, what is our quality of life? Why did we do all this? Why did we send all these young people to die? So Putin does not fear the enemy. He actually loves the enemy. What he fears is silence, because when there's silence, people begin to think, they listen to each other, they engage in conversation, they ask questions, and that threatens the whole construction of his power. In his system, periods of peace are undesirable because they bring chaos, and the enemy is a form of order because the enemy is something you can control. It's a paradox that's actually hard to explain to a Westerner, which is Putin delivers stability but rules through instability. It's not a failed strategy, it's his strategy. We can see the same cycle repeat again and again in the last 20 years of Putin's power. First, a crisis is either created or intensified. You know, it can be something that exists, it can be something completely manufactured. Second, a sharp and often aggressive response follows by the state in defense of the interest of Russia. And third comes consolidation, repression, and a spike in ratings for Putin, until this enemy becomes old and then a new one needs to be put in its place so that the cycle starts over again. Let's look at some examples. In 2004, the Bestland hostage crisis, it ended up with the abolishing of the governor elections. In 2008, Georgia, it ended up with increased militarization and a cult of the army. In 2014, we begin talking about Ukraine, Crimea, patriotic mobilization, the collapse of the ruble, and they begin talking that Crimea should be Russian. 2020, Navalny poisoning, mass arrests of everyone who was on the side of Navalny. 2022, Ukraine, the special military operation / war, fake news, economic isolation. It's not a bug, it's not random. This is the script. Manufacturing enemies one after another to remain in power basically forever. This is what political scientists call shock consolidation. In textbooks about autocracy, for example, Wayne Sanholtz had said, the autocrat creates a sense of crisis to justify expanding powers and restricting rights. So, in other words, it's chaos, manufactured, then fear, then the leader steps in, saving the day, and then order and repression. This formula has been seen globally, by Erdogan, Lukashenko, Orban, and all the autocrats in the world. So in the end, why does Putin do this? Well, because he doesn't like spontaneity, he doesn't like randomness, he cannot let go of the reins. So for him, any time of peace is chaos by definition, and so for him, actually an enemy gives a purpose and it's a tool to control the state. So the mechanism works as follows: create the fire, be the only firefighter, and then when someone asks questions about who started this fire, jail those people. This behavior creates a form of cognitive dissonance. If you think about it, why does the man creating the instability seem to be the only one able to control it? And the answer is very straightforward, which is Putin does not create pure chaos or anarchy. What he does is creating a sort of controlled turbulence that he knows perfectly how it works because he created it. So in a way, Putin shakes the system because he's the only one who knows how it works. So in a classic democracy, order is built through institution and collaboration between institutions, the House, the Parliament, the judges, etc. In an autocracy like Russia, it's actually done through a system of threats and saviors. Putin does not rule despite the chaos. He rules through the chaos. Chaos is a tool. He doesn't put out the fire. He just makes sure that every new blaze makes all the population say, oh, we're lucky to have Putin in power because he knows how to navigate this new hurdle, a hurdle that he created. And so we have a man that for 20 years has been inventing enemies to actually justify his purpose as a leader of a country. And this takes us all the way to 2020. If you remember the year of coronavirus, that pandemic that actually put the whole world down on its knees and generated huge areas of poverty and underdevelopment because of, poor access to medical equipment, to vaccines, you name it. All the world was caught by surprise by the pandemic, and of course that includes Russia. The pandemic lasted about 2 years and something, and then by the end of the pandemic, the whole world was in a state of depression, and all the major economies tried to basically boost the economy and boost the morale of the population because we had been depressed and frustrated because of the lockdowns and because of the deaths and all that for way too long. And then, of course, if you're the US and if you're the European Union or if you're Japan, you have a certain number of tools that you can do to actually motivate your population. But Putin plays by a different playbook, as we've seen. And so come 2021 end off and 2022, and of course Putin faces a country in disgust. It's a country that has lost thousands of people. It's a country that's questioning his role as a leader during the pandemic. It's questioning, the poor medical attention, the low quality of the Russian-made vaccines. I mean, they're seeing that in the rest of the world we were using Western-made vaccines which were very superior to the ones made in Russia. And of course, what happened at the start of 2022, Putin is in a fragile state. I mean, he sees that his reign of power may be weakening because of the discomfort and because of the anger of his population. And so, of course, Putin goes to his dacha and he opens his playbook of everything he's learned through the years, and he finds this word, enemy. And he needs an enemy, and it cannot be one of the enemies he's used in the past because those ones have been used already. He needs something fresh, he needs something new. And you know what, down there in the south and in the west, there was this short man who was actually talking about a new type of country, a country of kind of like Russian ancestry and origins, but a country that was actually looking more towards the west and looking towards the European Union and looking towards NATO and looking for a different type of society, a Slavic society, because they're all basically of Russian origin, but a different type of society. A society that showed what Russia could become, and of course that was very dangerous for Putin, because what if someone showed that there's something that could be Russia just better? That would put him in a very inconvenient position. And that takes us to Volodymyr Zelensky and the case of the war in Ukraine, and that's going to be the subject of the second part of this video, which is going to start right after this one. So this is DECODE, the channel in which I explain the modern world with no bullshit. In this case, this is a two-part video about Vladimir Putin because it's a very deep subject. This is video 1, which is about his upbringing and his political career. Video 2 focuses on his strategy in the war in Ukraine. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel, because this way you'll be notified when the next video pops up, which is going to be about the war in Ukraine. And this way, of course, you also help this channel, which is rather new, to actually grow. DECODE is my channel in English. It's born from a previous channel that I had in Spanish with this same type of content of political strategy and analysis and explaining the modern world. And so again, if you enjoy this type of content, please support the channel so that it grows and we can keep growing as a community. Thank you so much for being there, and see you on the next video of DECODE, where I will explain Putin's strategy in Ukraine. Bye.